So Ron, thanks for being here with the FPA today here at Concordia Summit. It's certainly a lively summit, and nutrition seems to be right in the crosshairs of much of the conversation today. Talk about that coming from IFAD, your organization, and how this brings you here to the table today.
Okay, great. Well, firstly, I'm from an organization that's a specialized agency of the United Nations, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD, as we like to call ourselves. We're both a UN agency, but we're also an international financing institution. So what we do is we make investments with our member countries in agriculture and rural development. We work in around 80 to 100 countries globally, and we tend to focus on those countries that are most in need, the countries that have the most food and agricultural nutritional challenges, and the areas which tend to be the poorest within countries is an area of focus for us. The conference, I think, has been a great opportunity, and one of the takeaways that I have is that there is a growing urgency around the need to really transform food systems. There's more attention to the way food interacts with environment, with biodiversity, with culture, with economics, and I think that is a very important dialogue to go forward with. In conjunction with the Sustainable Development Goals.
It's so interesting. We tend to put nutrition immediately looking at the goal number 2, right? End hunger, zero hunger. But at the same time, when you look at the basis of nutrition and even food as a commodity as it was for centuries, it really interacts with all the other sustainable goals.
It does indeed, it does indeed. One of the things that I think worries me and many others at the moment is the rise of global hunger over the past 4 years. And this has come out, I think, in many of the forums at this particular conference. At the moment, there are over 820 million people that don't have enough food, that go to bed hungry. And in our day and age, I think that's not acceptable. And what's really pleasing of some of the dialogue that I've heard is that there is this urgency that's building. It is not acceptable, and people are starting to call out that.
And yet nutrition, I understand, tends to be one of the least funded of any of these activities. Why is that?
There's probably a number of reasons. Nutrition is quite a complex issue, and when we talk about nutrition, globally, we mention undernutrition, malnutrition, and increasingly in the developed world is overnutrition. There's many complex factors, both on the demand and supply side, that contribute to this. And the complexity and perhaps the reason that we haven't been able to get clear messages, particularly to the broader public, around the importance of nutrition is perhaps one of the reasons that it hasn't been on the global radar.
It's interesting. I tend to think that most of us are stuck on malnutrition, thinking that's all encompassing, but it's interesting to hear it broken down here from the undernutrition to the overnutrition of that. How do we clarify that message for the regular folk that's probably going to help and reach for their wallet?
Probably one of the things is to look at the food system itself and how it interacts with our lives. Food and agriculture use the majority, a large percentage of global land. It's responsible for a large degree of emissions. It uses 70% of our water and has been responsible for the reduction of biodiversity across. So perhaps one of the important things of getting people to understand it is to see how food interacts with various elements of their lives, and the fact that food is fuel. What you put into your body does have an impact on your well-being. And there is increasing visibility and knowledge around that, but there's plenty more to do, I think.
Now, often when we go forward into other countries, especially, well-meaning as we may be in our campaigns, we sometimes have a rather large footprint that may not be organic to the ways of the people that we're trying to help. You said something so interesting at one of the panels that you were on about we have to look back in order to look forward. Break that down for me.
Well, one of the discussions that we had in the panel was very much about the global north, the developed countries, and what kind of sort of, dietary changes could be enacted. And a couple of the messages were about we need to not produce as much livestock, which is very true. What I was trying to frame is that in the developing world, the situation is very different and sometimes more complex. It's very difficult to go to a livestock farmer or a poor person who is undernourished and not getting enough protein and tell them that they're not able to benefit from animal proteins anymore. On the other hand, there is about 370 million indigenous people in the world, and they're responsible for about 80% of the world's biodiversity. For centuries across time, indigenous peoples have had an interesting interface between nature and nurture and human development. A lot of the crops that they produced, whether they're traditional grains or pulses, have sustained these populations for generations. A lot of that knowledge is not captured and is not valued, and it's lost. And that was the point that I made yesterday. Perhaps we need to look back at our history in order to map a path forward for how we can overcome some of the challenges we face globally today.
There's some movements obviously going on within certain health diets, should we say, where you eat more locally, focus more on what would be natural in your diet. But when you talk about the indigenous people too, it's a wealth of knowledge that we've seemed to grossly ignore, and yet they have been the ones that have been the sustainers of our forests and much of our indigenous plant. How do we tap into that knowledge?
Well, that's interesting. I think it's at a number of levels. It needs to be firstly about empowering Indigenous people to have a voice and influence over policies that affect them. It's making sure that there are the necessary policies in place to protect and to enable Indigenous communities to survive. I think it's about capturing the knowledge as well and disseminating the knowledge. I've had a number of interesting experiences in developing countries where the knowledge that Indigenous people brings has amazing solutions for some of the challenges that we face. So it's multifaceted, I think. But certainly putting a focus in looking back to look forward, I think is a key opportunity for us.
Well, I have to ask you, from the UN perspective, we have obviously the summit going on at the GA. They had a climate change meeting yesterday. We have 2030 agenda. The deadlines are coming due in just 10 years. What's your position? Are you optimistic? Should we follow your lead and say we should be worried? What can be done to meet those objectives in every step of the way?
I'm always optimistic, actually, always optimistic. And we talk about climate change or variability as the greatest challenge that faces us. Climate and climate variability is a threat enabler, and that's something that we need to deal with in order to reduce risk, but also to try and build resilience, particularly with those that are less fortunate or those that are more vulnerable, and that happens in developing countries. So I don't think the battle against climate variability or change is lost by any means. And I think there are lessons in developing countries that we can learn that can benefit developed countries. So I'm certainly optimistic, and I think the messages that have come out, particularly from young people, gives me huge optimism for the future.
One takeaway for us that you said we could step forward and do this, something path to follow, some level to learn or investigate, just on the individual level.
I think invest in smallholder farmers. In the developing world, the majority of food is produced by smallholder farmers, and there's about 570 million smallholder farms across the world. They have enormous potential to be custodians of our environment, to be the producers of more nutritious food, but they tend to be invested in and tend to be marginalized in a lot of cases. So my main message is don't forget smallholder farmers and rural people. They can be a part of the solution.
Well, thank you so much, Ron, for joining us here at the FPA and at Concordia. We'll keep an eye on everything that's going on with nutrition here at Concordia. Thank you.